Previously on The Revolution, Continental Congress took the ultimate step toward independence with a stunning declaration.
Jefferson wasn't writing anything that was revolutionary in the eyes of his own people, only in the rest of the world.
All of our founding fathers, they think they're going to hang. They are outlaws.
The British battled the Continentals in New York Harbor.
When the British come in the summer of 1776, it's like Star Wars. It's the Empire Strikes Back. It's the Death Star.
These soldiers were fresh off the farm, and so it was really a disaster for the Americans.
But a heavy fog allows the rebels to escape.
The failure to capture the Americans really was one of the greatest blunders of the war.
September 1776, New York. The rebel army is in retreat, pursued by the British up the Isle of Manhattan. In battle after battle, the colonial army is sent running, overwhelmed by the British forces and their superior power. The two sides engage at Kips Bay, then up Manhattan at Harlem Heights, and again north in White Plains. Only one lone American outpost prevents the total loss of New York and control of the Hudson River. Fort Washington, a garrison named after His Excellency George Washington himself. And now it is under a massive attack. George Washington watches the terrifying scene from just across the Hudson River. His last hold on New York is fading fast. Nearly all of his officers had recommended abandoning it. Fort Washington was not built to defend itself against such a sizable British onslaught. The Continental soldiers prepare themselves for a last stand, but they are in no shape for heroics. A month of steady defeats have left them exhausted. And now, again, they are outnumbered, 3,000 of them against 8,000 royals. It was Washington's most trusted general, Nathaniel Greene, who had convinced the commander to defend the fort. Greene, a young and talented Rhode Island officer, had, over time, become Washington's most trusted confidant. But this time, following his advice is a disastrous error in judgment for the rebel leader.
Nathaniel Greene opines that he can hold that fort with the men he has available to him, and he recommends that course of action to Washington. Washington trusts this very capable and energetic subordinate, and Greene was wrong.
The British army is unstoppable. Not only do they have the numbers, they put their big guns out in front. They unleash a fierce battalion of German fighters called the Hessians. The Hessians are unmistakable. From their armored helmets to their expertise with the bayonet, they are a near mythical vision from the old world. England has used foreigners for centuries to help fight their wars. But in America, the Hessians create a new specter. At once feared and hated, they are seen as outsiders in a conflict between brothers. They quickly gain a reputation as detested mercenaries.
The Hessians did not regard themselves as engaged in a civil war. And wherever the German mercenaries went, oftentimes there were allegations of all sorts of brutality, ranging from sexual violence to stealing of supplies.
These European fighters have been trained under a different set of ethics than the colonial army, an almost medieval sense of warfare. Plucked from society's cast-offs and often pressed into service against their will, the Hessian soldiers are ruthlessly drilled into fighting machines. Their rewards, when they receive them, come in the form of pride and a fair share of whatever plunder they can get their hands on. In America, they sang songs about their chance for treasure.
Go with us to America. There will be enough for all. There will be silver, gold, and money. Everything that a man seeks in the world, all that a man seeks there, is in America.
Essentially, the Hessians operated according to a code that made sense in Germany, but was very different from anything that Americans had been familiar with.
On this day, the Hessians earn their worth. They lead the British in overwhelming Fort Washington in mere hours. By afternoon, the rebels lay down their weapons. Fort Washington is surrendered, and along with it, New York. The two sides now face each other up close. The King's army and their hired warriors get their first chance to gaze upon the faces of the exhausted rebel army they have pursued for months. It is a sight that leaves them shocked.
A great many of them were lads under 15 and old men, and few of them had the appearance of soldiers. Their odd figures frequently excited the laughter of our soldiers. Captain Frederick Mackenzie, British officer.
The King's men had been fighting a wretched army, a band of citizens with little training. As the smoke clears over the dead and wounded, an amazing sight takes both sides by surprise. A young woman sits by her dead husband's side, but she had not been an idle bystander. When John Corbin fell from wounds, Molly Corbin stepped up to the cannons, firing on the British with the rest of the patriots. The British quickly send Molly Corbin home. There, after the war, she will die in obscurity. But on this day, the rebels will not forget the woman who evoked their cause. If this war is to persist, every citizen, man, woman, and child, will be called upon.
I feel mad, vexed, sick, and sorry. This is a most terrible event. Its consequences are justly to be dreaded. General Nathaniel Greene.
Half the army is captured at Fort Washington. New York and control of the mighty Hudson falls squarely into British hands. Some begin to wonder whether the rebels can actually deliver an independent America.
I was never in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born. I am wearied to death. General George Washington.
The Americans in 1776 have encountered nothing but reverses. It's defeat followed by defeat, withdrawal followed by withdrawal. This really negatively affects the morale of his force, and perhaps more importantly, affects the morale of some of his subordinate commanders, who really now question whether or not Washington is the right man for this job.
Between us, a certain great man is most damnably deficient. He has thrown me into a situation where I have my choice of difficulties. General Charles Lee.
Some of Washington's own generals now take their aim at his reputation. Washington and the army, at their weakest and most vulnerable, will soon have to face another battle. A power struggle at the very top. The revolution is about to stumble. November 1776. George Washington's Continental Army is in full retreat across New Jersey. He has just lost New York, and with it, half his army. Washington cannot afford another confrontation. Hundreds had died. Many thousands more had been taken as prisoners of war. Enemy captives are not something the British had planned for in this rebellion. Now they are forced to confront the problem.
After the defeat in New York, the British find themselves holding more American prisoners than they know what to do with. And so they're going to use the sugar hut and a number of other large structures that can quickly be made secure. They're also going to use prison ships.
Of all the places of internment, the ships quickly become the most notorious. Thousands are thrown into the holds of decommissioned warships. There, with inadequate food, hygiene, and air, disease runs rampant. Starvation is common. Being here is almost worse than a quick death on the battlefield.
Some of these ships would have 1,000 men, 1,000 prisoners, and perhaps a dozen a day would be taken out dead and buried in the shallow graves on the sandy shores of Brooklyn.
I now found myself among a collection of the most wretched and disgusting-looking objects that I ever beheld in human form, now shriveled and surrounded with the horrors of sickness and death. Here, thought I, must I linger till death should terminate my sufferings. Ebenezer Fox, prisoner.
To the British, these men are not just prisoners of war, they are traitors. Yet their punishment will not be swift. Instead of an executioner's hand, these rebels will be left to rot. Along Washington's retreat, there is no time for sympathy. No one knows what lies ahead for them. It is a minor consolation that they have become experts in at least one aspect of the military.
I can only say that no lads ever showed greater activity in retreating than we have. Our soldiers are the best fellows in the world at this business. Colonel Samuel Webb, Continental Officer.
With retreat comes more recrimination, this time from within Washington's own ranks. General Charles Lee is among those who revel in Washington's failures and secretly scheme against him. In late November of 1776, Lee steps up his campaign for the commander's job. Like Washington, Lee is ambitious for glory, but their similarities end there. Where George Washington has a famous grace, Charles Lee has an infamous coarseness.
He was a slob. He didn't wash. He always had a pack of dogs going everywhere with him. He consorted with low women. He was not a gentleman. A corporal's wife would be his preference.
Yet as a general, his prowess is undeniable, even intimidating. He had, after all, learned his skills in the best army in the world, the British.
Lee is arguably the most qualified general officer in the American Army in a strictly military sense. He fought in the French and Indian War, he fought in continental Europe during the 7 Years' War, he fought from Russia to Poland. He's exceptionally experienced, but this experience breeds some hubris. He thinks that he knows better.
Passed over for promotion in England, Lee jumped ship for America, only to find himself subordinate to George Washington. Now, Lee's sense of self-worth pushes him toward betrayal once again. This time, he wants what he deserves: command of the Continental Army.
I foresaw all that has happened. Had I the powers, I could do much good.
Confidence in General George Washington is at an all-time low. Lee's chance is at hand. Late November 1776. The two generals now lead regiments in separate retreats. Washington through the center of New Jersey with the main army. Lee north with a regiment of 4,000. As they move, Lee corresponds with all those who might be sympathetic to his personal cause. These include a once faithful adjutant to Washington, a certain Colonel Joseph Reed.
Dear General Lee, I do not mean to flatter or praise you at the expense of any other, but I do confess it is entirely owing to you that this army is not totally cut off.
Reed, too, encourages a change in leadership.
We are in an awful and alarming situation. I think yourself and some others should go to Congress to form the plan of the new army. Joseph Reed.
Charles Lee has just such ambitions, and lets many in Congress and the Army know it. Only George Washington himself remains unaware of the plot at hand. that is about to change.
Washington, by accident, opened a letter from Charles Lee to Joseph Reed, and it was clear that the two men had been discussing Washington's fatal indecision of mind.
My dear Reed, I lament with you that fatal indecision of mind, which in war is a much greater disqualification than stupidity, or even want of personal courage. Eternal defeat must attend the men of the best parts, if cursed with indecision. General Charles Lee.
Washington's response was to write to Reed and say, I opened this by accident, I thought it was official business, and to just try to smooth it over. I think all of these moments really just highlight the extraordinary kind of equilibrium that he maintained.
Washington lets it pass, but he can have no doubt that his own power is weakening. His errors in New York are becoming widely known, and those who once threw their support behind him, the Army, and the cause of independence are now compelled toward doubt. A sense of doom gathers across America.
Washington is devastated by his defeats. This public relations disaster means that the people don't support the Army. They're back to maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't try a revolution.
It is the opportunity the British have been waiting for. Into this vacuum of power and the flagging spirit for rebellion, they issue a proclamation. They offer leniency to those who pledge allegiance to the king. Those who will not shall be considered traitors.
Every American had to choose. Do I support the patriots? Do I support the loyalists? Is there any neutral ground between them? How do you make this choice? People are not only making this choice according to their political beliefs or whether they, really respect the king or not. They're often making this choice according to what's best for them.
The soul of the revolution is now up for grabs. Who will come out ahead? General Charles Lee, George Washington, or the British Army? What each does next will determine the outcome. America's revolution hangs in the balance. December 1776. British are gaining control of New Jersey, yet they find a populace unwilling to support them. With their massive army, food and supplies are critical to their efforts. Out of need and a hint of vengeance, the British turn to more forceful methods. They take what they need by whatever means necessary. It is a bitter taste of what America might look forward to under full British military occupation.
They have taken hogs, sheep, horses, and cows everywhere. Even children have been stripped of their clothes. In short, the abuse of the inhabitants is beyond description. Charles Wilson Peale, American soldier.
Soon, the Hessian mercenaries join the fury, cutting their own path of plunder across the colony. Along with them, stories of brutality spread far and wide, allegations of torture, rape, and murder. Such acts become a rallying point around which to sway colonists against the British. Patriot newsprint quickly takes full advantage.
They stripped them of their cash and clothes, poor creatures. Many of them died. The devil's not more cruel.
It was a huge propaganda coup for the colonists, who were able to isolate a few incidents of Hessian brutality and atrocities and project that as par for the course. It helped muster more support for the revolution and demonstrated to the Americans the extreme lengths to which the British were willing to go to put down this insurrection.
The British had aimed to bolster loyalty in New Jersey. Instead, their actions stir up an infuriated population. Patriots and loyalists now take up arms against one another as the War of Independence descends into anarchy and civil strife. Washington can sense the mounting chaos. Both sides, loyalist and patriot, seem to have given up on the cause of the revolution.
As Washington flees across New Jersey and people are unwilling to help him, he fully realizes that this revolution might be over. He's a commander-in-chief of an army that has shrunk drastically. He's on the run with the enemy on his heels. Congressmen write their wives and their friends letters saying that the game is just about up. They're fearful that this war is shortly going to be over.
Washington turns his focus toward Philadelphia, around which he will try to build a defense. But General Charles Lee's troops are still 50 miles north. Without them, Washington's numbers are inadequate. Like it or not, he needs Lee. Lee has other plans, and they don't include helping Washington. He ignores the commander's almost daily pleas to rejoin the main army.
December 1. Dear Sir, the enemy are advancing, and from information not to be doubted, mean to push to Philadelphia. I must entreat you to hasten your march as much as possible, or your arrival may be too late to answer any valuable purpose. General George Washington.
Technically, Washington could have ordered Charles Lee to do what he wanted.
Dear Sir, having wrote you fully both yesterday and today of my situation, you will readily agree that I have sufficient cause for my anxiety and to wish for your arrival as early as possible.
Perhaps Washington thought that with a loose cannon like Lee, perhaps the best way was not force, but to cajole him into seeing things the same way.
Friday the 13th, 1776. General Charles Lee has no intention of coming to Washington's aid. Instead, he stops his retreat and takes residence in a comfortable tavern. There, Lee makes his final move. It won't be a good one. Lee works over his correspondences denigrating George Washington. Yet he remains unaware of the scene just outside his window. British scouts have tracked Lee to the tavern and will take him by surprise.
The scene was almost comical if it hadn't been so tragic. Lee was surrounded by a British cavalry in his dressing gown, slippers basically.
Lee puts up no fight. In one brazen and sloppy moment, his campaign for leadership of the Continental Army comes to an abrupt halt. London celebrates the capture. The traitor Lee, some say, is the only rebel general they had cause to fear. Even the stock market goes up on the belief that this is the coup that will end the war. But Washington is not so easily fazed. A political rival out of the way, and his absent troops now marching toward him, Washington regains his sense of mission. His own officers, like General Nathaniel Greene, take notice.
His Excellency, George Washington, never appeared so much advantage as in the hour of distress.
Again, it falls to Washington to turn the fortunes of the war, if it isn't too late. New Jersey is now a battlefield, not only for the two armies, but for the colonists themselves. Amidst the tension, citizens weigh their loyalties. Should they side with the fleeing Continentals or with the British occupiers, whose very presence has created fresh hostility in the colony?
And this is what happens, right, when you put military men in the charge of what is also a delicate political operation. And in this respect, I think one has to be a little sympathetic to the British government. Putting down an anti-imperial, anti-colonial uprising is not something anyone had much experience with in the 18th century.
As winter sets in, both sides retrench. The British occupy more of New Jersey by spreading smaller units throughout the territory. Washington, meanwhile, escapes into Pennsylvania, where he hopes to prevent an attack on Philadelphia, the seat of Congress. Mid-December 1776. The mood of despair has crept into his own soldiers as well. Many simply decide it is time to go home. Faith in the revolution is falling as fast as the temperature.
It's been a wretched year for them. Conditions have been harsh. Smallpox has broken out in the army. That's in addition to the other camp diseases that ravage the army at regular intervals. Militarily, things have been disastrous. There's not a lot of incentive for them to stay.
One man watches in horror. Thomas Paine had joined Washington's army as one of the Revolution's first war correspondents. Now, the young author of Common Sense, who helped spark independence only a year earlier, knows he must once again take up his pen. This time, he will not aim his words at the enemy, but directly at the hearts of American patriots.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. Thomas Paine.
With a sense that the war rides as much on his words as on the musket ball, Paine rushes to Philadelphia to print his new manifesto. There, Paine finds his hometown in chaos. Fear and rumor are spreading like a virus. Citizens are convinced that Washington's forces won't be able to defend Philadelphia. In response, people flee. A steady stream of Philadelphians take their belongings and head elsewhere, leaving their empty homes and closed-up shops to the British, if they should come. The citizens are not alone. Continental Congress and all its members have evacuated too, heading further south to Baltimore. Against this backdrop, Thomas Paine gets to work. In a span of 10 days, the young author and printer, the man who arrived in America only a few years ago full of hopes to begin a new world in these raw colonies, sets his thoughts to print. He titles it American Crisis. As quickly and widely as Common Sense had spread, so too does this book. It begins to work its magic instantly.
What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. And it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Thomas Paine.
This was really the low point for the Americans. Washington's reputation was really at stake, and with that reputation, the ability to round up fresh recruits for the army. So it was a really do-or-die moment in New Jersey.
Paine's words only go so far. Washington must alter his entire approach to the war. He must make some bold move that will restore faith in him and in the durability of the revolution.
He makes up his mind, I've got to shift tactics. He thinks that it isn't necessary to win the war on the battlefield. He just can't lose it. The most important thing is to keep the army together. At the same time, back home, convincing the mothers and wives and children of British soldiers that the cost of this war is too high in deaths, casualties, and for Parliament too, in money.
For the British commander, William Howe, things are not going as planned. The occupation of New Jersey has spread his forces thin. In London, people are asking why the war is not yet won. He needs time to think. Howe has his army dig in for the winter. To guard against rebel attacks, he places Hessian forces at key junctions along the Delaware River, places like Burlington and Trenton. As the cold sets in, the British expect to catch their breath before the next season of fighting begins. Howe's command along the Delaware River falls to Hessian Colonel Johann Rall. Rall has been on constant alert, but now, holed up in Trenton, he is finally beginning to relax. An attack is unlikely as the weather turns grim, and a blizzard blows outside his window. Rall lets his guard down and waits for reinforcements, due any moment. Christmas Eve, New Jersey. Rall's Hessian reinforcements have made an unscheduled stop. Their commander, Colonel von Donop, has decided to spend the night with a fair widow in Mount Holly, just 20 miles from Trenton.
The colonel, who was exceedingly devoted to the fair sex, had found the beautiful young widow of a doctor. He wanted to set up rest quarters in Mount Holly, which, to the misfortune of Colonel Rall, he was permitted to do. Captain Johann Ewald, Hessian officer.
Von Donop's rest will have consequences he cannot imagine, and history will soon record the contribution to the revolution made by the mysterious widow of Mount Holly, whose identity will never be known. Some believe she may have been Betsy Ross, the future creator of the American flag. Scouts soon report to Washington that the Hessian army has left its defenses down. Washington hatches his plan. He will attack. It may well be his last shot, a final effort to revive his reputation, the spirit of his soldiers, and the survival of the revolution. In the last cold days of 1776, Washington prepares his army for what may be the final gambit in the War of Independence. Few believe he can still be victorious. His own soldiers regularly leave the army as their commissions come up. An urgency creeps into everything and everyone.
We are all of the opinion, my dear General, that delay is now equal to a total defeat. Some enterprise must be undertaken in our present circumstances, or we must give up the cause. Joseph Reed, Continental Officer.
By the time Christmas of 1776 approaches, everything has bottomed out. His army has shrunk to only about 5,000 men. He's lost the support of a lot of the people, and all appears to be lost. It truly is a do-or-die situation.
Washington makes a bold decision. He will strike the enemy at Trenton. On Christmas Day, Washington tells his army to prepare. After months of defeat and loss, they understand his purpose. The army will now take the offensive. They will be crossing the Delaware back to New Jersey. Shortly before departing, Washington has American Crisis read aloud.
Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet and to repulse it. Time hath found us. Thomas Paine.
It will be a monumental task. Washington's men must ford a near-frozen river in a blizzard and get across fast enough to take the enemy before dawn by surprise. Yet Washington's leadership, his army, and the revolution all ride on the success of this singular mission. Washington himself will lead the soldiers into battle for the first time in the war. The general knows that if they fail, there will be no more chances. At 11 p.m., the boats begin to cross. It will be harder than they had even imagined.
Every school child in America is familiar with the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, when he's boldly in the front of the boat, standing up, looking heroically towards the eastern shore of the river. It would have been nice, but it didn't happen like that. Nobody stood up that night, wisely so.
It was as severe a night as I ever saw. The frost was sharp, the current difficult to stern, the ice increasing, the wind high, and at 11 it began to snow. It was only with the greatest care and labor that the horses and artillery could be ferried over the river. Captain Thomas Rodney, Continental officer.
It takes most of the night to get the army over. It costs them severely in time. As dawn approaches, this surprise attack on the Hessian forces at Trenton grows nearly impossible. For a moment, Washington considers turning back.
It made me despair of surprising the town, as I well knew we could not reach it before the day was fairly broke. I determined to push on at all events. General George Washington.
5 a.m. The weather worsens and the temperatures drop even further. The soldiers, some with only rags on their feet, begin to succumb to the elements.
I was so benumbed with cold that I wanted to go to sleep. Had I been passed unnoticed, I should have frozen to death without knowing it. But as good luck attended me, Sergeant Madden came and made me walk about. John Greenwood, Continental Fifer.
Not all are so lucky. 2 soldiers lay down in the snow, never to get up again. The others press on. Everything now depends on speed and stealth. It is Washington's new way of waging war.
If he's victorious, fine. If he's defeated, escape as fast as you can and keep your army together. Move fast. Sneak attacks, surprises, midnight escapes, any trick a magician could pull out of his hat. That's how he's got to fight.
Washington had learned his lessons the hard way. Now he will change the rules. In a swift move, he catches the Hessians off guard. It sets off a fierce battle. Hessian soldiers scrambled to grab their muskets and meet the enemy. Colonel Rahl wakes up to a battle already underway. He had been expecting something from the rebels, but nothing of this scale. Nor is this the same army the Hessians once met in New York. Now the Continentals fight with fierce spirit. In bloody, chaotic engagements, they hold their own. Trenton is a small battle in numbers, but it is a vicious and closely fought one.
Battle of Trenton is a brutal encounter. The Americans surprise the Hessians, who tumble out of their barracks, grab their muskets, and attempt to defend themselves. The battle lasts less than an hour, though. The Hessians don't have a chance because they're surprised.
Here conceived a scene of war of which I had often conceived, but never saw before. The hurry, the fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump shall sound. Colonel Henry Knox, Continental officer.
In the midst of the fighting, the Hessian Colonel Rahl is shot twice. As he dies in bed, the leaderless Hessians lose their will to go on. The path that had taken them from victory in New York ends with defeat at Trenton. 1,000 Hessians are captured or killed out of only 1,500 present. It is Washington's day. Trenton sends a resounding message. The Continental Army is back, and Washington is their undisputed leader. In a year of hardships and loss, he has now learned how to fight this war.
Trenton illustrates the genius of George Washington. Here is an opportunity to strike the enemy where he's weak, when he's weak. This is going to establish the pattern for the rest of the war, in which the Continental Army will always live to fight another day, pick low-hanging fruit, frustrate the British, and continue to provide a thorn in the side of the different British commanders.
Yet Washington faces one more challenge before 1776 is over. December 31st marks the last day of many soldiers' commissions. Many, if not all, are eager to return to their citizen lives.
At the end of December, a lot of enlistment terms run out. Those men want to go home. He goes back onto the field, and he tells them, as heartfelt as he can, that you've done everything that America could ask of you. You've risked your lives, you've been in fierce encounters, and now I'm asking you to do it just one more time. And he waits, and nobody moves.
The men have given all they can. Now it is Washington's turn. To anyone who will re-enlist, Washington makes an offer of an additional $10 pay, more than a month's salary.
My brave fellows, you have done all I have asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake. We know not how to spare you. General George Washington.
And then one soldier grumbles, well, I might as well keep fighting. He steps forward. Then others follow him. And eventually a little bit more than half the men in the army stay for the $10. But he doesn't have the $10.
Washington writes to Congress to request the emergency funds. For this trifling sum, the Army holds together and grows as news of Trenton brings new recruits. At the very end of this dark year, Washington has revived the Revolution.
Through most of the fall, there have been a number of officers who thought they could do his job better than he could, and a number of members of Congress who thought the same. That changes after Trenton. That criticism evaporates, at least for a while. And it seems that the tide has turned. At least the Army is going to continue to exist. And the Army is the Revolution.
1776, the year America is born, and a grueling test for the new nation. Liberty is embraced, and then very nearly lost. Washington has saved the Revolution, but the biggest battles still lie ahead. With cautious optimism, a friend of George Washington writes him a New Year's card. The year 1776 is over. I am heartily glad of it, and hope neither you nor America will be plagued with such another. Next time on The Revolution. After losing Philadelphia to the British, Benjamin Franklin needs a decisive victory at Saratoga to convince France to back the rebels.
His job is essentially to make it appear to the French that the American cause is a viable one and that the Americans can win this contest. Those are all of them, at that point, fictions.
A declaration of war between France and England would change what was once a colonial uprising into a world war.